There are places in this country that do not appear on any map you would trust. Roads that begin with confidence and end in silence. Stretches of land so flat and so indifferent that the sky above them seems to press downward, as though trying to smother whatever grows beneath. These are the places where America forgets itself, where the great project of civilization thins out like paint applied too generously across too wide a canvas, until you can see through it to something older underneath. Something that was never named, because naming it would require acknowledging it, and no one who built this country ever wanted to do that. I have driven through many such places. I have passed through towns that felt like memories of towns, where the gas stations stood empty, but the lights still burned, where the churches were full on Sundays and the graveyards were fuller still. I have eaten in diners where the coffee was always fresh, but no one ever seemed to arrive or leave. But there was one place, one particular settlement in that long corridor of nothing that stretches between the places people go, that stayed with me, that climbed inside my thinking and refused to come out, that still visits me in the particular hour of the night when the mind is too tired to defend itself. I will not tell you exactly where it is. I will tell you only that it sits in a depression in the earth, as though the ground itself had exhaled and never breathed back in, that the trees around it are twisted in ways that trees are not supposed to twist, their branches reaching not upward toward the light, but sideways and downward, as though they were trying to cover something or hold something down, that the road into it is paved but barely, the asphalt cracked into patterns that almost resemble something, that almost form a language if you stare long enough, which you should not do. I first heard of this place from a man I will call Raymond, because that is what he called himself, though the way he said it suggested it might not be the name he was born with. Raymond worked at a truck stop 300 miles from nowhere in particular, and he had the eyes of a man who had seen something he could not translate into ordinary language, but had been trying ever since. He told me about the village the way a person describes a dream, in fragments, with apologies, with the constant qualification that perhaps he was remembering it wrong. Perhaps the light had been strange that day. Perhaps he had been tired. People always say that, I have noticed, when they want to tell you something true that they are afraid you will not believe. Raymond said he had stopped there once, years ago, when his truck had broken down on the long road through. He said a man had come out of the brush to help him, and that this man had been— He paused here and looked at his coffee cup, and looked at the window, and looked finally at me. Had been shaped differently than men are usually shaped. Not injured, not ill exactly, shaped differently. As though the blueprint had been followed, but with certain liberties taken, certain corners cut, certain additions made that the original designer had never intended. The man who came to help Raymond had an arm that was longer than the other by perhaps a foot, ending in a hand that had too many fingers, each one jointed at intervals that did not correspond to any anatomy Raymond had ever seen. The man's face was broad and low, the forehead receding to almost nothing, the jaw extending further than jaws are meant to extend, the eyes set wide apart and slightly misaligned, one looking at Raymond directly, and the other looking at something over his shoulder that Raymond was afraid to turn around and see. And yet this man had fixed Raymond's truck with patience and skill, had handed him tools with those impossible fingers as naturally as you or I might pass a salt shaker across a table, had spoken in a low voice that was difficult to understand at first, but became clearer the longer you listened, the way a radio signal comes in stronger as you approach the tower. The man had offered Raymond a place to sleep for the night. Raymond had declined. He had driven away as quickly as his repaired engine would carry him, and he had not stopped until the sun came up and he was in a different state entirely. But the thing that stayed with him, he said, the thing that kept visiting him in the night, was not the man's arm, not the extra fingers, not the jaw or the eyes. It was the moment, just as he was pulling away, when he glanced in his rearview mirror and saw other people emerging from the trees to watch him go. Many people, standing very still. all of them shaped, in their various ways, differently. I spent the following months collecting other accounts, as one does when something has taken up residence in the mind and will not pay rent. I found them in the places you find such things, in the margins of local newspapers, in the testimonies of people who had called late-night radio programs and been laughed at, in the careful handwritten letters of individuals who had seen something they needed to report to someone, anyone, even a stranger. The accounts were consistent in the ways that true accounts tend to be consistent, which is to say in their texture and their emotion rather than their specifics. Different people described different deformities, as though the village contained multitudes of variations on a single theme. But everyone who had passed through that region and had some brush with that place described the same atmosphere, the same quality of light, the same feeling of being watched by something that was patient in a way that ordinary watchfulness is not patient, something that had been watching for a very long time and had learned to be comfortable with it. There was a woman, a botanist, who had been conducting a survey of native plant species in that region for a university that would prefer not to be named here. She had camped near the village for 3 nights before she understood what she was near. The plants, she told me, were wrong, not diseased, not invasive, wrong in the way that the plants around a toxic site are wrong, except that she could find no evidence of any toxin, no contamination, no buried chemicals, no industrial history. The plants simply grew in configurations that plants do not normally grow in. Flowers with too many petals arranged in spirals that followed no Fibonacci sequence she had ever encountered. Trees whose rings, when she found a fallen one and cut across it, told a story of growth and cessation and growth again that didn't correspond to any weather pattern or seasonal record she could map. As though time worked differently there, as though the rules that govern how living things accumulate their years had been suspended or rewritten. She left on the 3rd night, not in response to anything that happened, but in response to a feeling. She said it was the most profound feeling of wrongness she had ever experienced, and she had worked in Chernobyl, she had walked through the dead zone, she had stood in places where human civilization had committed its most spectacular violence against the natural order. And this was worse. This was quieter, and it was worse. Because Chernobyl, she said, was the story of what happens when we do terrible things. This place felt like the story of what happens when the terrible things are simply true, when they are not the result of anything but simply the condition of the world in that particular coordinate. I want to be careful here, because there is a way of telling this story that would be dishonest. There is a way of telling it that would make the people of this village into monsters, and that would be easy, and it would be wrong. They are not monsters. They are people. Whatever has shaped them, and I will come to the theories, such as they are, because there are always theories, whatever has bent and extended and compressed and rearranged their bodies into forms that make strangers flinch and look away, they have built a life inside it. They have built community. They have built something that functions, after its own fashion, as a civilization. From the accounts I gathered, and from the one encounter I will describe presently, the village had a structure. It had a center, where the oldest and most severely transformed individuals seemed to live, and it had a periphery, where the younger and more recently arrived or born ones kept closer to the boundary between their world and ours. It had what appeared to be a governing council of some kind, though how decisions were made was opaque to any outsider. It had what appeared to be places of worship, or at least places where people gathered for purposes that had the weight and the atmosphere of the sacred. And it had children. This was the thing that people consistently found most difficult to process, the detail that appeared in accounts with the most emotional freight. It had children, small ones, learning to walk on legs that were configured for it only approximately, learning to reach for things with hands that would always have to find their own particular grip, learning to see with eyes that showed them the world from angles that no one who had not also grown up here could quite imagine. I drove out there in October, when the light in that part of the country is the color of old photographs, and the wind comes down from somewhere north of everything. I drove for 2 days, and I camped one night by the side of the road under a sky so dense with stars it seemed structural, as though the stars were holding the darkness up rather than punctuating it. I ate from a can and drank coffee from a thermos, and I thought about Raymond, and about the botanist, and about all the other people who had passed near this place and carried away something that changed them, subtly, in the way that a photograph is changed by exposure, that is, by becoming more fully itself. I found the depression in the earth on the afternoon of the second day. You know it first by the trees, exactly as Raymond had described them, branches reaching in the wrong directions with an urgency that seems almost biological, almost intentional, as though the trees were trying to say something with their arms. You know it next by the quality of the silence, which is not the absence of sound but a different kind of sound, a frequency just below the threshold of hearing that you feel in the jaw and behind the eyes. And then you know it by the smell, which is the smell of wood smoke and something cooking and human habitation, the ordinary smell of lives being lived, and the shock of that ordinariness against the strangeness of everything else is perhaps the most disorienting thing of all. I stopped my car at the edge of what I will call the approach, a widening in the road that might once have been a turnaround, or might simply be a place where the earth had decided to give a little, and I sat for a long time. I am not a fearful person, or I did not used to be. I have made films in war zones. I have interviewed men who had done things that made the air around them feel contaminated. But I sat in that car for a very long time, because the fear I felt was not the fear of violence or of physical harm. It was a more fundamental fear. The fear of having the categories by which you understand the world revealed as provisional, as local rules that apply in most places, but not all, as agreements that most of reality has consented to honor, but that this particular piece of reality had never signed. A child appeared at the edge of the tree line. I want to describe this child accurately, and I want to resist every impulse to describe it in a way that serves the horror of the story at the expense of the truth of the child. The child was perhaps 6 or 7 years old, by my estimation, though it is possible that age read differently here, that the body markers I would use to gauge a child's years were not reliable in this context. The child's head was very large, larger than the body beneath it seemed built to support, and the child moved with a carefulness that suggested this was a thing it had learned to manage, rather than a burden that defeated it. The child's eyes were extraordinary. I say this without irony, and without the false comfort of making beauty into compensation for suffering, because I don't know that there was suffering, and beauty is not compensation for anything anyway. The eyes were simply extraordinary, dark and very still, and possessed of an attention that most adults have trained themselves out of. The child looked at me the way children look at things before the world teaches them that looking too directly is rude or dangerous or revealing. It looked at me as though I were interesting. We watched each other for a long time. Then the child turned and went back into the trees, and the quality of the silence changed again, and I understood that I had been announced. An older person came out not long after, an adult, though the word feels inadequate, as most words feel inadequate in this account. A woman, I believed, of perhaps 50 years, though again I cannot be certain. She moved with a deliberateness that was not slowness, but was instead something more considered than ordinary motion, the way a person moves when they have spent a lifetime navigating a world that did not build its doorways or its furniture with them in mind. Her spine described a curve that the human spine is not usually asked to describe. Her hands, when she raised them in a gesture that I interpreted, perhaps incorrectly, as greeting, were shaped in ways that I will not enumerate because enumeration feels like inventory, and she was not a collection of aberrations to be catalogued. She was a person who had come to speak to me. We spoke for some time. Her voice was low and precise. She had grown up here, she told me, and her mother had grown up here, and her mother's mother, going back as far as any story in this place reached. She did not call what they had a condition or a disease or a deformity, and I noticed this, and I honored it. She said they were as they were. She said this with a flatness that was not resignation, but was instead something much more complete than acceptance, something on the other side of acceptance, where the question of whether things should be otherwise has simply ceased to be a question. I asked her whether people were born this way or whether they became this way, and she looked at me with something that might have been patience or might have been a more gentle form of contempt. And she said that in her experience, those were not the separate things I seemed to believe them to be. She said that the land shaped what lived on it over time, that this had always been true, that the particular shape of this land, the particular qualities of this depression in the earth, and what lay under it, and what moved through it in ways that instruments did not measure, had shaped her people across generations the way any environment shapes what lives within it. She said this without drama. She said it the way a farmer might discuss soil composition, or a fisherman might discuss the patterns of a particular stretch of river. I asked her whether they wanted to leave. She looked at me for a long time before answering, and during that silence, I became aware of other people at the edges of my vision, shapes among the trees, still as the trees themselves, watching. She said that wanting was a word that carried a lot of assumptions inside it. She said that people here lived and loved and made things and buried their dead and raised their children and told each other stories. She said the children here were not afraid of what they were. She said this in a way that made me understand, without her having to say it plainly, that she found the fear of the children out there, the normal children, the ones growing up in the world I came from, considerably more tragic. I asked her about the people who had passed through, the ones who had seen the village and carried away their terror and their disrupted sleep. She smiled at this, or made a movement with her face that was the equivalent of smiling, and she said that she was always sorry about that. She said she understood why it happened, the fear, the flight, the sleepless months afterward. She said she did not take it personally, though she said this with a quality that suggested the people of the village had had many generations to practice not taking it personally and had developed a refined art of it. She said that people from the outside world were most afraid, in her experience, not of what they saw, but of what they felt. The sense that the world was larger than they had been told, the sense that the rules were local, the sense that beneath the surface of the ordinary there was something else, not malevolent, not benign, simply other, simply itself, going about its business in ways that did not require their understanding or their permission. She walked me to the edge of the village before the light began to change, before whatever passed for dusk in that place began to gather. I saw more as we walked. I will describe what I saw as honestly as I can. I saw a community. I saw people working, building, carrying, cooking, doing all the things that people in communities do. I saw two people having an argument beside what appeared to be a well, the kind of low-stakes argument that is really an expression of familiarity and comfort, the kind that only happens between people who are sure enough of each other to be irritating. I saw an old man, one of the oldest people I have ever seen, sitting in a chair that had been modified to accommodate a body that had spent 9 decades finding its own configurations, and he was doing something with his hands that it took me a moment to recognize as knitting. He did not look up. He was not afraid of me or interested in me. He was knitting. I found this more moving than I expected to. I saw a group of children, perhaps 8 or 10 of them, playing a game that involved throwing a ball through an improvised hoop, their bodies moving with an unself-conscious athleticism, finding in their unconventional architectures not obstacles, but simply the given conditions of the physics of their lives. They made adjustments the way all athletes make adjustments. They found the throw that worked with the arm they had. They ran with the run their legs allowed. They shouted when they scored in voices that were high and clear and exactly as unguarded as children's voices everywhere. What is horror, I have been thinking since that October afternoon. What is the thing we call horror when we apply it to this story, to this place, to these people. Because I drove away that evening with something changed in me, something fundamental rearranged, and I have spent a long time trying to understand what it was. And I think what it was not what I expected it to be. I expected to be haunted by the strangeness, by the bodies that did not conform, by the evidence of something in that land, in that particular depression in the earth, that worked upon living matter in ways that science had not gotten around to describing. And yes, that was there. That stayed with me. The nightmares I had in the months that followed were not pleasant ones, and I will not pretend otherwise. But the more enduring disturbance was something else. It was the realization of what we have built on the outside, in the world I drove back to. The world of the normal. The world that has decided, through processes of violence and exclusion and the quiet brutality of the average, what a human body is allowed to be. The world that takes its children and teaches them, before they are old enough to question it, that there are bodies which are acceptable and bodies which are not. That there are faces which can be looked at directly and faces which require looking away. That there is a correct human template, and everything that deviates from it is an error. The world that has built its doorways and its chairs and its mirrors and its stories, all to the specifications of a single, fictitious, idealized body that has never actually existed and never will. The children in that village were not afraid of what they were. This was what the woman had told me, and this was what I had seen. And this was the sentence that came back to me in the night, more than any image of twisted branches or impossible anatomies. The children in that village were not afraid of what they were, because no one had taught them to be. Because the world they grew up in reflected them back to themselves without apology or exception. Because the stories they were told, by the firelight, in the voices of the old ones, were stories in which people who looked like them were the protagonists, were the heroes and the fools and the lovers and the wise, were simply the people in the world rather than the exceptions to it. I drove through the night to get back to the highway. The trees fell away behind me and the road straightened and the sky opened up, and I was back in the world I knew. The world with its gas stations and its billboards and its radio stations playing the same songs in rotation. And I noticed, in that first hour of ordinary road, ordinary light, ordinary world, that I was looking at things differently. That the people I passed, the few other souls on that long road at that late hour, looked to me as they always had. And yet something about the looking had changed. Something about the certainty with which I could say, "This is how a person looks," had been gently but irreversibly undermined. There are things living in the gaps of this country. Things that have made their peace with being in the gaps, with being outside the story that the country tells about itself. The official story, the one with its founding myths and its manifest destiny, and its relentless, exhausting insistence on normalcy as virtue, has no place for a village in a depression in the earth where the rules of the body have been rewritten over generations by forces it cannot explain. Has no place for children who throw balls through hoops without ever having been told they ought to feel ashamed of the arms that throw. Has no place for old men who knit in chairs that fit them. And so the official story pretends the village does not exist, and the village returns the favor, and they leave each other more or less alone, except in the moments when a truck breaks down on the wrong road, or a botanist follows a survey into unexpected territory, or a documentary filmmaker sits in a car for a very long time at the edge of a widening in the road, trying to find the courage or the foolishness, and finally, unable to distinguish between the two, simply opens the door and steps out. The woman walked me back to my car as the light changed. At the edge of the approach where the paved road began again and the trees thinned into the ordinary, she stopped and stood and looked at me, and I looked at her, and there was a moment between us that I have no proper language for. It was the moment of mutual recognition that happens sometimes between people who are very different and know it, and are not afraid of the difference, and are not pretending it away. It was the moment of understanding that both of you are human, that this is not a small thing, that it is, in fact, the only thing, the thing that makes both the strangeness and the ordinary possible. She told me one more thing before I got in the car. She told me that they had a name for the world I came from, a word in their particular language which I could not reproduce phonetically even if I tried, but which she translated for me. She said the word they used for the outside world, for the world of the normal, for the world of the correctly shaped and the properly formed, was a word that meant, as best she could render it in my language, the place where they are afraid of everything. She said it without cruelty and without satisfaction. She said it as a description. I drove away. I watched in my rearview mirror the way Raymond had watched in his, and I saw her standing at the edge of the trees, very still, watching me go. And behind her, at the margins of vision, the dark shapes of her people, standing still, patient in a way that ordinary watchfulness is not patient. Having watched strangers drive away for longer than any record preserves, and understanding, in a way that the strangers rarely do, that the stranger's departure says more about the stranger than about the ones who remain. There are places in this country that do not appear on any map you would trust. I have been to one of them. I carry it with me now the way you carry a true thing, which is to say, heavily, which is to say, gratefully, which is to say, with the permanent slight ache of something that has opened you wider than you asked to be opened and does not intend to let you close again. The twisted trees, the child with the extraordinary eyes, the old man knitting in his fitted chair, the sound of children shouting when they score, high and clear and utterly without shame, and the silence of that land, that particular frequency below hearing, felt in the jaw and behind the eyes. The silence that is not the absence of sound but is something else, something that was there before sound and will be there after, something patient, something that has never needed us to understand it and has never, in all this time, asked.